In 1958, Lana Turner's 14-year-old daughter stabbed a man and killed him. Not just any man, but Johnny Stompanato, who was Lana Turner's lover. This might sound like a Lana Turner movie, but it was real life, and it was a big deal. As you can maybe imagine, the news media was interested in the story. The trial was a huge sensation. I'll tell you how it turned out a bit later, but this video isn't really about what actually happened. It's about the movie Where Love Has Gone, which was based on the book Where Love Has Gone, which was loosely based on Stompanato's killing. Don't worry if you haven't seen this movie, because it isn't very good, but it does tell an interesting story about what happens when classic Hollywood makes a movie about itself. Okay, there's Sunset Boulevard, there's The Bad and the Beautiful. There are a lot of movies about Hollywood. Even some movies about Hollywood movies. Even some movies about Hollywood movies about Hollywood movies. Hollywood does love, actually, to make movies about itself. One of its favorite subjects, I think. But this is a little bit different, because this isn't Hollywood weaving its own legend. This is a story about something that was in the news first. This is a spin on something that really happened, perhaps. One reason that I think this is particularly interesting is that these days, 2023, that's now, maybe, we have a lot of movies like that. Movies about things that actually happened. Movies about things that were in the news just yesterday. For example, even before Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced, you could watch her story on Netflix. Now, Elizabeth Holmes wasn't exactly a movie star. Who knows? She might become one. But I think still there's this rise of the biopic thing, possibly rise of the biopic. You can debate down there which one you think is right. That does seem to be a trend over the last few years. One of the discussion questions for the day is really the big question for the day is, are these new biopics about these movies, about things ripped from the headlines, are they really new at all? And how do today's methods of corralling real events into a mainstream movie compare with the methods of classic Hollywood? I'm curious what you might think about this, but first, let me tell you a little bit about this movie, Where Love Has Gone. For whatever reason, the title of this movie, Where Love Has Gone, is not intuitive to me at all. I will probably say it wrong at some point in this movie. I have a tendency to say, Where Has Love Gone, not Where Love Has Gone. Anyway, you'll see in a second that the title betrays the structure of the movie and also the tone, the maudlin tone of the movie. This film came out in 1964, 6 years after the killing of Stompanato. It was directed by Edward Dmytryk, who was a fairly legit director, one of the Hollywood 10, interesting guy. It was produced by Joseph E. Levine, who was a very legit producer. He produced Godard's Contempt, for instance, although Godard may have been contemptuous of him while he was doing so. You can go check out my video on Contempt if you're curious. The movie stars Susan Hayward, this movie, not Contempt. Stars Bette Davis, and stars Mike Connors. Mike Connors was probably best known for playing Mannix on television. Who's Mannix? Who knows? This movie wasn't a hit when it came out, so take some things I say with a grain of salt. This isn't exactly the paragon of classic Hollywood because it was poorly reviewed. Critics didn't like it. Audiences didn't like it. But still, it shows some of the tricks. And in some ways, these movies that are less well-liked, I think, do more to reveal the mechanics of an era. This movie is not very well remembered today, I guess, and I don't think that's a fluke. This really isn't a great movie, but it is a little better than I had expected. It's not total garbage. It's probably about 30% garbage. So just look away for that 30% and you'll be fine. Almost everywhere that I've discussed this, that I've seen this movie discussed, it has been introduced as a movie about Lana Turner and Cheryl Crane, her daughter. But if you watch this movie without being tipped off about that, you would probably have no idea that it's about an actress or that it's about her. This really might not be the best example of a biopic, and it's possible the framing I've just set up for this whole video might be completely off because this movie is almost entirely fictional. Let me give you some examples of where it diverges from real life. In real life, Stompanato was killed in Beverly Hills. This movie is set in San Francisco. It's interesting. Between Los Angeles and San Francisco, we probably get maybe half of classic Hollywood movies. Maybe not, but a lot of classic Hollywood takes place in one of those locations. Why might a director choose one of them over another? Interesting question. Here, why might they choose to export this particular crime from Hollywood to San Francisco? I don't know. In real life, Lana Turner was an actress, you might be aware. Here, Valerie Hayden, her counterpart, played by Susan Hayward, is a fine artist, a sculptor. In real life, Turner's ex-husband, Steve Crane, was an actor and a restaurateur. He owned a chain of tiki restaurants, in fact. In the movie, he's a war hero. His name's Luke Miller. He's a war hero who wants to be a builder. Not an architect, but a builder. He's constantly talking about his big ideas for housing plans. Basically, he wants to make a bunch of subdivisions. He wants to make suburbs. It reminds me a little bit of It's a Wonderful Life, I guess. This is what good Americans did, apparently. They dreamed about building and living in subdivisions. When I realized how different this movie is from reality, I almost scrapped this video. But I think that these divergences are actually quite interesting. I mean, is Hollywood really trying to tell us that we should think of Lana Turner as a fine artist and this guy who built a lot of tiki bars as a heroic architect of American suburbs? Maybe this is reading into things a little bit too much, but that is my specialty, after all. And I think it's fair to say that this is, in some ways, kind of an extreme movie. Let me give you sort of the didactic backbone of the film. Let me sketch it out. First of all, there isn't a moment in the movie where it seems like the kid, Danny is her name, Cheryl Crane, in real life. Cheryl Crane, by the way, still alive, in her 80s, I think. There isn't a moment in this movie where it seems like she might be guilty of murder. We learn very early on that she's going to be treated, she's going to be tried as a child and rehabilitated rather than punished. Can you imagine if the American justice system actually worked this way, particularly in the 1960s? Strangely, this movie skips completely over the trial. Maybe they felt that it was so widely publicized that they didn't need to replicate it or that it would be difficult to. But it kind of felt like a ripoff to me. We do get some courtroom scenes, a couple courtroom scenes at the very end in the form of a custody hearing, but they're absolutely terrible. So who knows? Maybe it's best that we didn't have more in a courtroom, but you would certainly expect that if this really is an adaptation of the events. Like I said, even without a trial, it's a foregone conclusion that Danny is not at fault, that she's not going to go to the electric chair or to prison. Don't worry, though, the movie will blame things on a woman. Not just Valerie Hayden, but also her mother, Mrs. Gerald Hayden, played by Bette Davis. Bette Davis, Mrs. Gerald Hayden, does she even have a first name? Mrs. Gerald Hayden is probably the closest thing this movie has to a bad guy. Bette Davis is a very interesting actress. She played a number of nasty characters throughout her career, including this one. And partly, this is a tribute to her versatility. Fans will say, look, what a versatile actress. And I do think Bette Davis is a good actress. But I also always wonder about these catty roles. Why were they so salient with the public? Why did people identify with her, or why were people so riled up by her? That's a question for another day, but Bette Davis, interesting. Good actress. This is a fine, sort of middle-of-the-road performance from her. The didactic game plan of this movie is really pretty simple. It's not Danny's fault that she stabbed somebody. Instead, it's a symptom of the breakdown of the family unit, because of course it is. This is classic Hollywood. Now, what happened to the family unit? Well, it was poisoned, mainly by Bette Davis, who was an overbearing and elitist mother, an unworthy mother, a failed mother. Hollywood, of course, has a long history of diagnosing failures of motherhood, and here's another proud entry into that genre. This movie follows a formula that many classic films do. It shows us a real crime, but then it begins an investigation into the domestic morality of the characters, as if that will inevitably reveal the means, motive, and what's the third one? Opportunity. Bette Davis, like I said, if she's the bad guy in this movie, then is there a good guy? Who is it? Well, you can probably guess. It's the army man, Luke. He comes home with a medal. When Danny is checked into her rather nice accommodations at Juvenile Hall, when she's in the lobby about to surrender, saying her goodbyes, she gives something to her father before going in. It's a small box. She says that she's never been apart from it and that she can't bear to have it taken from her here. She wants to give it back to him. Luke opens up the box and sees his medal from the war. Can you get any more 1950s than that? Like I mentioned, Luke's other virtue is that he is a suburbanist. Even though he becomes an alcoholic, even though he tries to rape his wife, Luke is set up as the moral center of the film. This is kind of a simple game plan, like I said. It's not Danny's fault. It's this breakdown of the family unit, which is mainly Bette Davis's, and to some extent, Valerie's fault. Okay. It's not quite that simple. There are some other didactic angles that sneak into the movie. For instance, there is a counselor at the juvenile hall that seems here and there to be a voice of judgment. Actually, at first, it's not quite clear who the voice of judgment is. Luke is always shown as kind of the good guy. But the mother, the grandmother, and the psychiatrist are all kind of poking at Danny to try to get inside, to try to figure out what's going on in her mind. And they all have some theories about it, but it's not clear who really knows. And it's not clear who the proper maternal figure really is in the movie. That's one thing that's kind of interesting about this film, is that there's a struggle between these different characters to be a maternal figure. The grandmother, being extremely overbearing, had served like that. Valerie sort of comes into her own at some point and wants to take up that mantle. But then there's also the state-provided mother of the juvenile hall. Interesting. By the time the movie ends, the mother and the grandmother have been revealed as unworthy and immoral. There's an interesting scene where the counselor confronts Valerie about this upcoming custody hearing. Valerie says that she has a legal right to raise her daughter. And the counselor says, in this case, you have no legal rights. You lost them the day you brought a man to live with you in this house in front of your daughter without the benefit of marriage. I quoted that fairly directly. I don't know if that was actually the law, but it's a stark reminder that people's personal lives are not their own. In this movie, that's almost spun like it's a good thing. One of the particularly mediocre plot points in this movie comes when Danny is examined by the doctors at juvenile hall. We learn that these doctors, we don't see the examination, but we learn that they conclude that she is no longer a virgin. Try not to faint. This causes a major stir, of course. It's interesting. People don't seem to mind too much that she smokes cigarettes, I think in the movie she might be 15. People don't seem to mind that she's smoking, but they're pretty upset that she's not a virgin. In some ways, yeah, like I said, it's your personal life is not your own, particularly in the 1960s, early 60s, the 1950s, the old days. What can I say? It might feel like I'm having it both ways here a little bit, because I said early on that the didactics of the movie are really simplistic and mechanical, but I then gave a bunch of examples of how it's actually a little bit weirder and more complicated, how it's a little bit messy. Which one is it? Well, it's both of these things, I think. Simplistic in some ways, but also kind of messy. It turns out that it takes a lot of work to wrangle complicated real stories into mainstream packages. Lana Turner's real life was complicated and messy. It wasn't Hollywood friendly. So of course it's going to take a lot of messing around to turn it into a movie. One pretty interesting piece of evidence of that is that this movie has some extremely cryptic dialogue in it. For instance, when we learn that when we learn about the examination, it's not really said directly. I forget exactly how they put it, but Danny says, "Oh, well, that could have happened riding a horse or whatever." And the nurse says, "Oh, that's the oldest excuse. We're not going to believe that." It is later called out quite clearly, but there's a lot of dancing around things in this movie. If you were to ask me, is this an edgy movie? I would say, well, I mean, in some ways it kind of seems like it is, because it seems like it's butting up against the censors in some place, and it's taking on material that is interesting. It's taking on a story that revealed that Lana Turner, this Hollywood starlet, was in fact leading a life that was in some ways quite different from what Hollywood would promote, although maybe somewhat in line with some of her movies. I don't know. I mean, it was pulling back the curtain in a way that was deeply provocative. In some ways, it's almost a subversive story, and it does seem like kind of an edgy thing. But the movie is also profoundly milquetoast, profoundly orthodox, trying to corral everything into this very mainstream framework. And this shows up perhaps nowhere more clearly than in some of the language they used to try and dance around things when they talk about, because this is a story inherently about intimacy and about sex, right? How do they cope with this in this movie? Well, with a bunch of goofy euphemisms. That's how. There's a few more telling details that I want to mention. First, this movie has a very particular view of financial morality. The wealthy Haydens don't come off very well in the film, of course. They're shown as being stuffy, elitist, and it seems like the message is that if you have a lot of money, you will probably screw up your kids. Seems clear you don't want to inherit in this film. Big banks also don't come off very well. In the movie, they refuse to lend Luke any money, even though he is a war hero, and even though he has all these great plans for subdivisions. This isn't to say that business in general is bad, though. Luke goes into business for himself at one point. He also gets a position handed to him by the Haydens. That doesn't go very well. But when he goes in on his own, when he's living the American way, he does better. Although it's true that his ultimate show of virtue is that he's willing to turn his back on his own company and financial success to support his daughter. That's the ultimate virtue. So it might seem like things are kind of all over the place when it comes to business. How much money am I supposed to have? Where is it supposed to come from? But this is actually a fairly common formula for movies of this era. Don't be, no generational wealth. Don't be a corrupt businessman, but pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and follow the American dream, right? This is the kind of thing, this populist messaging that you might find in the Frank Capra movie. This film dips into it here. Something that's a little more uncertain, I think, in the movie is the view of art that it gives us. Like I said, Valerie is a sculptor. The movie is a bit ambivalent, though, about the value of art. In general, Valerie's work is coded as being legit. I think my favorite scene in this entire movie is when her agent brings her good news. This isn't a good scene, but it's very interesting. He brings her some exciting updates about her career. She's going to be the first woman to have 3 pieces commissioned by the United Nations. It's funny to me that the pinnacle of the art world is the lobby of the United Nations. That's what it means to have really made it. Once again, the movie is sticking international politics and some form of American nationalism, although the United Nations, it's not purely American, but I don't know, 1964, it's interesting. It's sticking this international politics stuff just about everywhere it can. I think this is all sincere stuff. And I think the movie is suggesting that art does have some true value, that this is in some ways a noble career. On the other hand, Valerie is also shown to be kind of unfit in many ways, derelict in her duties as a mother. And there are moments where her work seems to be a part of that. And there are moments where her work is shown to be, I guess, kind of goofy. Not because it is the Slavic avant-garde of something like Paul Newman's character in What a Way to Go. That movie came out the same year as this one. Pretty interesting stuff. Not because it's too hip, but because it's too stuffy. The Haydens are elitists, remember? Luke, the working man, the soldier, introduces himself to Valerie by critiquing her work. This is kind of a common trope in movies, I think, actually, where there's like artist woman and worldly macho army man or something like that. And of course, the guy enters the gallery. He starts talking to the woman. He doesn't know that she's the artist, of course. And he starts giving his comments on, oh, well, this person doesn't know what's up. And then it's revealed that she's the artist. And for some reason, this is how a romantic, this sparks romance. These movies always tend to prioritize the man's view over the woman's. It seems like usually there's some credence given to this guy being like, well, yeah, you made a sculpture about logging, but I'm actually a logger. You don't understand what it's like, or something like that. That perspective seems to get the upper hand most of the time. And the same is kind of true in this movie. The sculpture that Luke walks up to is about death. It's about dying. And it's true that Luke, fighting in the army, probably has more firsthand experience with that than she does. And he schools her about what death is like, or what he thinks it's like, or something like that. This sparks their romance. So like I said, the movie kind of has it both ways in some ways. Art is shown as being pretty legit, a real career path. I mean, you can have your work shown in the United Nations. But it is also kind of a stuffy and elitist thing in some ways that Luke, the everyman, the soldier, the suburbanist, can see through. Of course, art is complicated in the real world too, and it's possible that this is an example of the movie actually having some nuance. Maybe it's just convoluted. I don't know. Another interesting angle is that this movie features a lawyer very prominently. In real life, Cheryl Crane was represented by Jerry Geisler, a Hollywood lawyer who represented all kinds of upstanding movie stars, such as Errol Flynn. When scandals broke, it was common for someone to quip, "Get me Geisler," almost as if it were a badge of honor to behave so badly that you would need his services. In this movie, the lawyer is deeply concerned, not by the law, but by optics. He spends far more time talking about how people need to look than he does talking about the law. That's the reason Luke comes to San Francisco in the first place, actually. He needs to act. He needs to be there to show that Danny has a father figure. This movie has basically zero legal rigor, but it's interesting to have this lawyer character here. It's interesting to see a movie that is sort of a movie about Hollywood, to see that it has a character who is so preoccupied with choreographing how everything looks. Okay, one little final thing, which is that there's a scene where Valerie goes over to the wrong side of town. One thing about Johnny Stompanato that makes the whole story interesting, that made the whole story so provocative in real life, is that he was seen as kind of a shady character in some ways. I'm not going to assert whether he was or not. It's possible there was some immigrant sentiment behind all this or something like that. But he was perhaps involved with some shady figures, I guess. That is kind of represented in the movie. At first, you wouldn't know it at all. At first, you would have no idea. It seems like he would just be another businessman. But at one point, Valerie does go over to the shady side of town, and you get sort of this interesting look at crime, although it's so kind of unedgy and just so they beat around the bush so much in the scene. It's a little hard to watch. But can you guess what kind of music is playing when Valerie crosses the tracks? Yup, it's jazz. Overall, this isn't a great movie, but like I said, it isn't terrible. There are a couple of scenes that go. Some of the romantic scenes in the movie are actually fairly compelling. Not exactly steamy, but they're fairly compelling. The ending is absolutely terrible, but the movie is decent as long as you can overlook a couple of absolutely crippling pieces here and there. Like I said, I'm more interested in the mechanics of adapting a headline into a movie. In classic Hollywood, this was sometimes a messy and a difficult task. How do you take this weird, not, Hollywood-friendly story and not, make it into something that, for one, makes the censors happy, but that also is, a family movie or whatever, is this 1950s mainstream thing. It's hard for me to sum up the process by which this is done, but this movie is a very good example of it. So again, the big question is, are things any different now? Are modern biopics any more nuanced? Or do they also try to shoehorn complex stories into the mainstream moral zeitgeist using the same kind of shoddy mechanics? Well, I've avoided watching any of these new mainstream modern biopics, these Netflix series and such, so I don't really know. But this movie is almost tempting me to check one out. So who knows? Maybe that'll be next week's video.